afternoon. I'm Pat Cohen, and I'm here to introduce you to my friend Barbara Isenberg. Barbara has been writing and lecturing about arts and issues and personalities for more than 3 decades. Formerly a staff writer for the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, she has also written for Esquire, The Nation, London Sunday Times, and the Huffington Post. The LA Times Arts and Books wrote that Gehry's long relationship with Isenberg has produced a bestseller, which shows a level of trust and familiarity that allows him to open up in ways he has rarely done publicly. The Library Journal called her book a gold mine for scholars and the general public. Founder and host of the Gehry Center's Art Matters public interviews, she has received many awards and has been a visiting scholar at the Gehry Research Institute. And she was formerly Associate Director of the LA Institute for Humanities at USC. In May, Barbara will celebrate her 30th year hosting the London-based British Theatre Backstage, an annual tour featuring visits to London's theaters, museums, and interviews with actors, critics, and other theater artists. 5 years ago, Jamie, Helene, Ira, and I went on Barbara's tour. That's how we met her and have remained such good friends. It is the most wonderful week, even when she escapes and goes on a 4-hour train ride to spend the day with David Hockney. A year later, we went to the Hockney exhibit in San Francisco, and in the last room of the exhibit, there were about 24 photographs of his friends, all in black and white. But at the top, in the middle, was Barbara in color. There are a few spaces available on the trip in May, so if you're interested, talk to her at the end. Please join me in welcoming Barbara.
Thank you, Pat. That was that was entertaining and wonderful. And I want to thank Jamie Kabler and everyone at the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival, my friend Tom Lutkin, for inviting me here today. It's a great honor. I'd also like to thank Frank Gehry, a very busy man who let me ask him many, many questions for several years. So I wanted to start by telling you one of my very favorite stories about Frank Gehry. A few years ago, he was told he needed to have a brain scan, and so he agreed to spend some time in the cramped, claustrophobic confines of an MRI diagnostic chamber. As machines thumped and hammered, he slipped into himself and his imagination. After 45 minutes, the doctors had their MRI, which showed absolutely nothing unusual. Architect Gehry, on the other hand, had the preliminary design for the Louis Vuitton Foundation, a unique glass-encased museum destined for the Bois de Boulogne in Paris. I focused on it the whole time I was in the machine, Gehry told me, thinking about it, fantasizing and designing it. And then he put those thoughts on paper, and here's what he came up with. Now you can laugh, but wait till you see what it looks like. Now, as you probably know, because there was a lot of publicity when it opened, the Vuitton Art Museum opened in Paris in October 2014. So look at this again. Now, this is what it looks like. Okay, now this is also what it looks like. Now, you want me to go back to the image, to those drawings? You can see for a second? Hope this works. Okay. I mean, I think it's amazing, but yeah. Okay. Okay. I retreat into my own world a lot when I'm driving or in an airplane too, Gehry says. My father used to call me a dreamer which he did not mean as a compliment. And he was right. He just underestimated the power of dreaming. Now, few dreamers have so captured the public's attention as Frank Gehry, widely considered the most important and influential architect of his time. He has won dozens of awards from the American Institute of Architects alone. He won the coveted Pritzker Architecture Prize, the very first Lillian Gish Prize, the National Medal of Arts, even an honorary doctorate in engineering from a university in Nova Scotia. His Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, has been called the world's most celebrated building by the New York Times. Celebrated new building. The Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles has also been considered a visual and an acoustic masterpiece. Now, I'd written about Frank Gehry and his work for a very long time, interviewing him again and again for newspapers, magazines, and books since the 1980s. And not so long ago, he invited me over to the office for a chat. He was nearing 80 then. He is 86 now. And he had been thinking about his legacy. He knew me, he trusted me, and he wanted to know if I was interested in working with him on his oral history. So, I mean, who would say no? So I was immediately drawn to the idea, having enjoyed our many earlier interviews, and what began as an oral history soon evolved into my book, Conversations with Frank Gehry. At his Los Angeles office and his Santa Monica home, over restaurant breakfasts and really awful conference room lunches, we talked about the family he was born into and the families he created, who he wanted to be and who he became, what architects do generally and what he does specifically, and most importantly, the influences that have shaped his ideas and his work. This is an image of Gehry Partners' sprawling office complex near the Los Angeles airport. In a cavernous, one-time industrial space, dozens of architects, designers, model makers, and others, mostly young, worked on projects in various stages of development all over the world, including France and Philadelphia, Berlin, and Abu Dhabi. The workplace is broken down by project, and as each grows or shrinks in terms of dominating office time, so does it grow or shrink in terms of office space. Now, when he's in town, Gehry usually works upstairs on the second floor away from all this activity, but he doesn't stay away very long. He's on and off the main floor, viewing and reviewing designs and models, talking with colleagues, spinning a model around to get a look at all of its sides. He also has a studio downstairs, and most of our talks took place at the work table in that studio. At the far end of the table was usually a visual inventory of work most on his mind that day. A building model he was thinking about, a product prototype, maybe a stack of construction photographs from an ongoing project. At our very first visit, the table held a lightweight white paper lamp. And it wasn't paper-like lamp, which would later be called the cloud. A possible wood container for the lamp appeared on the table a few weeks later, and soon came a gorgeous bracelet, harbinger of the Gehry collection for Tiffany's. At Gehry's less cluttered end of the work table, there was always drawing table and a pen nearby. For as Gehry remembers, he also draws. And our initial conversations about his childhood, for instance, were punctuated by breaks for him to draw such things as the papier-mâché horses his father made, the first Toronto neighborhood he remembers, the first house he lived in as a child. Frank Gehry was born on February 28, 1929 in Toronto. His father, Irving, was raised in New York's Hell's Kitchen and was a boxer, a truck driver, and a salesman who also had an interest in drawing. His Poland-born mother, Thelma, was self-educated, returning to high school as an adult, and she was also a violinist who introduced her son to both art and music. A picture of her son. Leah and Samuel Kaplan, his mother's parents, were extremely important to Gehry as a child, and he spent a great deal of time with them at their home, their hardware store, and their synagogue. His grandfather was a Talmudic scholar who taught him to be curious and to ask questions. And the two of them would talk about the Talmud when they were at the hardware store, fixing clocks or cutting glass. His grandmother, in turn, had a wood stove, and he would often go with her to a neighborhood shop for leftover wood pieces. When they got home, she would fill the kitchen floor with pieces of raw wood in every kind of shape. And the two of them would sit down on the floor and they would create bridges and buildings and little cities. And whenever Frank Gehry and I would talk about his choosing architecture as a profession, our conversation would inevitably lead back to those times with his grandmother. Quote, "When I was choosing a profession, I didn't know what I wanted to be or what to do with my life," Gehry told me. "I started thinking about what was the most fun I ever had in my life. What would be something useful to do? And I had an image of being on the floor with Grandma making stuff." So later, as an adult, he realized it gave him a license to play. That was very important, he told me many times in many different ways, because, quote, "When you start out in architecture or in any of the arts, the baby steps you take are very scary. By the time you get there, you've been through a school system that tries to make everything rational, mathematical, and logical. And all of a sudden, you're confronted with something that's emotional and intuitive. You look for anchors, and my anchor was this memory of my grandmother." Now, this is a picture of Los Angeles and of Bunker Hill in the 1940s. When his family moved to Los Angeles in 1947, the city's frontier spirit soon kindled Gehry's own. He often speaks of the visual chaos of Los Angeles at mid-century, a magical place teeming with experimentation and freedom. He told me once that had he stayed in Toronto, he probably would never have become an architect. Not only would he not have been accepted at the University of Toronto Architecture School, given his test-taking ability, but the culture in Toronto would not have given him the sort of nurturing that he got from the California art scene. Artists became his colleagues, his supporters, and his friends. His house, his studio, and his heart are filled with images and experiences and souvenirs of his lifelong admiration for and friendships with artists from Ed Moses in Los Angeles to Robert Rauschenberg in New York. Few subjects interest Gehry as much as the subject of art, and few people inspire him as much as artists do. With the legendary Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles as its focal point in the late 50s and the early 60s, a generation of Los Angeles-based artists were making Los Angeles a vital center for art and artists both. Gehry, who opened shop himself during that period, talks again and again of those times, those artists. Now here are works by two of his artist friends from that period. This is a sculpture by Peter Alexander. It's still in the sculpture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. This is a painting by Billy L. Bankston. Now, a sort of discussion that artists were having in Los Angeles, he says, quote, led to my own language and made it possible. That kind of discussion was not happening in Toronto. So I asked him once what sorts of things he learned from the Los Angeles artists. His reply, for many of them, the craft and the art were one. It was not two separate acts, and that intrigued me. I was hoping an architect could do that. Their work was more direct and in such contrast to what I was doing in architecture, which was so rigid. You have to deal with safety issues, fireproofing, sprinklers, handrails, things like that. You go through training that teaches you to do things in a very careful way, following codes and budgets. But those constraints did not speak to aesthetics. So when I got close to these guys, I'd hang out at their studios, I'd watch them work, and observe how they dealt with things. It was very different. I was terribly enamored with the directness of it and how they had to confront a white canvas. That whole process seemed so much more likely to produce beautiful work than the architectural process did. I knew pragmatic things had to be taken care of, and I could do that, but it wasn't enough. The way these artists thought and approached making things was a lot more in touch with who they were. It seemed that was the way to find your voice, not the way I'd been doing it. So I started mimicking their process, which was hard to do in architecture. And of course, now you can see where it led. He and I discussed how, unlike the visual arts, architecture goes through so many hands. Gehry said, quote, building a building is like birthing the Queen Mary in a small slip at a marina. There are lots of wheels and turbines and thousands of people involved. The architect is the guy at the helm who has to visualize everything going on and organize it all in his head. Architecture is anticipating, working with, and understanding all of the craftsmen, what they can do and what they can't, and making it all come together. I think of the final product as a dream image, and it's always elusive. You can have a sense of what the building should look like, and you can try to capture it, but you never quite do. So consider this sequence of images of the Walt Disney Concert Hall. This is Gehry's original drawing of the concert hall. It's one of his very early drawings. Here are some Disney Hall models. Now each of these models was about the size of a shoebox, and this picture is of a wall of these models. And there were many more, probably hundreds more, of various sizes, because as the building develops, the models get larger and larger. Here's Disney Hall under construction. This photograph was taken by Gil Garcetti. Do you remember Gil Garcetti? And this is Disney Hall today. And this is the interior of Disney Hall, which is sort of not your typical concert hall interior. Now, because Gehry has created such distinctive work, from his chain link and plywood of the 1970s to his undulating metal and glass, people forget he started out very traditionally. He studied first at the University of Southern California's Architecture School, and after the Army at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Although his earliest work reflects his modernist training at USC, Gehry was soon experimenting with form, idea, and materials. Much as other artists were exploring art made of found objects and industrial materials, so was Frank Gehry. This is a model for his own house in Santa Monica, where he took a bungalow, just an ordinary bungalow, and reimagined it in 1978. And it became a laboratory for his ideas. And many architects do this. They kind of test their own ideas on their own homes and families. And this ended up being the project that sent him careening to national attention. And by the way, he and his wife Berta still occupy this house. This is a model, but it looks very much like this. They don't live in the model. As architects and architecture students trekked through Gehry's residence, tour buses were not far behind. And the architect's home began to rival Graceland for a while. His confidence and reputation both on the incline, Gehry soon ventured from chain link and plywood to steel, copper, titanium, and glass, creating buildings that were more and more sculptural. Artists accepted him when fellow architects would not, and their influence became part of everything he created, whether that bracelet for Tiffany's that I mentioned earlier, or a complex of high-tech buildings at MIT's Stata Center. Now, for Gehry, this particular bunch of buildings looked to him like actors on a stage. Now, if you look at it long enough, you'll notice kind of they're all kind of bending toward the center of the stage. If you look at it for a very long time. The references that he makes to in some of these buildings may be as familiar as a Matisse cutout or as obscure as a chapel ceiling in Padua, Italy. And Gehry associates say they are often looking up paintings that he has referred to in design discussions. You know, take a look at this book cover. For Gehry, everything is inspiration. He told me that this sketch and photograph of a building in Dusseldorf came from, his inspirations were both the 20th century bottle paintings of Giorgio Morandi and Giovanni Bellini's Renaissance painting of Madonna with Child between John the Baptist and Saint Elizabeth. You all were probably thinking that. He may get irritated at remarks about his looking in his trash can for ideas, which a cartoon version of Gehry actually did in a popular episode of The Simpsons. But it wouldn't surprise me if he does. Here, for instance, are some photographs that he took in the 70s of old industrial buildings in Los Angeles that he thought had some, quote, weird intrinsic reality. Now also, I mean, notice on these, there are 3 of them, that notice also the space around the buildings, because he's as interested in the space around them as he is the buildings. So at one point in our conversations, when he was talking about a particularly difficult design process, I asked him quite simply how he managed to keep inspiration going at such times. Here is his reply. Gehry, I tell my students when you're stuck, go to a museum. I do it myself. I'll go to a museum, I'll look at a painting, and that always uncorks me. I'll always find something in the painting. I do it with literature a bit too, and with music. Concerts make me explode with ideas. It's just uncontrollable. Sometimes I can't even focus on the music. I get so carried away. But the best trigger for me is going to a museum. Isenberg, given the design of your buildings, does sculpture have a particular attraction for you? Gehry, yes, but painting more. Sculpture is more definite. Painting is more ephemeral, so you can read more into it. You're freer to interpret from paintings than you are from a 3D object. You can fantasize more. It's not that the images you're looking at are translatable into a building. It's the fact the images are there, and they're so beautiful. They're so filled with ideas. Isenberg, what about instinct? Gehry, I find something and I tend to poke at it, like a cat pokes at something. I'm curious. It's like following a thread. I trust my instincts, and I think it's important to learn to trust one's instincts. I always say if I knew in advance where I was going, I wouldn't go there. So I'm constantly letting things just evolve in response to a problem. Isenberg, you've often talked of how you use the energy of others to fuel your own. Gehry, when I was a kid, I studied jiu-jitsu, and then much later, karate. Jiu-jitsu is interesting because opponents come at you, and you use their energy to overwhelm them. You take the energy that they supply to the event to contain them, and I find that's true in creative work, too. You can sometimes turn those kinds of assaults in the working relationship to accept the challenge and then take care of it, so to speak, using the energy of the people who are trying to mess with you. There are two kinds of energy. There's the energy that probably comes from my mother pushing me for many years to do something, and I guess I'm afraid to disappoint her even though she's gone. But there's also the energy of the work that grows out of the excitement of the project. A lot has to do with the people involved and their willingness to play with me. I think the best buildings come out of that. Isenberg, how do you define play? Gehry, creative play is childlike. It's questioning. It's fun. Well, it's partly fun. It's looking for something. You don't know what, and in architecture, you're doing it with a lot of other people. Ideas also come from the client, of course. Consider, for instance, his headquarters building for IAC Interactive Corp in New York. IAC Chairman Barry Diller, for whom Gehry built a unique glass structure, told me that it all began when he and Gehry chatted about the building's location in Chelsea, right across the street from the Hudson River, and about how much they both liked to sail. As you can see, Gehry drew a sketch which suggested sails in the wind. And Barry Diller says he was amazed at how much the finished building looks like that sketch. Now those of you who've seen the building would surely agree with him. Here's the building. I mean, I think it's amazing how much this one looks like the sketch. I'll go back to the sketch. Actually, one of my favorite anecdotes about Gehry concerns that building. Gehry's reputation often precedes him into a boardroom, and Diller once told the Los Angeles Times that he was expecting Gehry to be expensive, difficult, and ornery. So when I later asked Diller if that proved to be the case, he remarked, "He's not expensive. That reputation is totally undeserved from my experience. He's absolutely not difficult. Ornery? Yes. Nicely, wonderfully ornery." Now remember, this is a man who once gave a talk called, quote, "I'm not weird." And even his great patron, Thomas Krenz, former director of the Guggenheim Foundation, used to describe Gehry as sort of like Peter Falk in Columbo, partial to rumpled clothing and a slightly distracted, seemingly self-effacing manner. Today, however, he's a celebrity, an architecture superstar at a time when architecture itself is a superstar. This is why. This is a color sketch of the Guggenheim in Bilbao, Spain. Remember that he is the man who designed the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. This is a picture of the Bilbao Museum seen at night, and which you probably know led to that city's economic rebirth. Or, as Frank Gehry said it, well, quite as a quote, "I guess it did put the city of Bilbao on the map, and I guess it put me on the map as well." Here's the interior of the Guggenheim. And here is another image at a strange angle. Well, anyway, if you were all to, I don't know how to adjust it. You're just going to have to guess what it looks like. But it's another shot of Bilbao taken by the late Sidney Pollack, the director of sketches of Frank Gehry. And the man that Gehry always, there we go, thank you, that Gehry felt always took the very best pictures of Guggenheim Bilbao. Now, Beethoven was known to write down musical ideas, which he called sketches. And if something didn't work in one piece of music, he would use it in another. So have other composers, and so does Gehry. If something doesn't work in one place, it will be back in another. Now actually, if something works well in one place, it would still be back in another. The 14th century sculptor Klaus Sluter, and in particular the 17th century painter Jean Vermeer, can be found lurking in many a Gehry project. Gehry readily admits his great passion for the pleated headdress in this 1661 Vermeer painting called Young Woman with a Water Pitcher. He credits the painting's influence, for instance, on his design for the roof of Maggie Centre, a cancer treatment facility in Dundee, Scotland. Now maybe you see these pleats again in this image of the Pritzker Pavilion in Chicago's Millennium Park. So let me again hand Gehry the microphone. Isenberg, do you have a favorite time when you're working on a building? Gehry, yes. It's when I have the plans and the scale right for both the neighborhood and the project in block form, before I make those curved shapes, before I do anything. When I get to that point, I feel comfortable this is where we're going. And the next move is just to finish the detailing, the materials, and the character of the shapes. It's what I call being in the candy store, because it's the fun part. It's also the most scary part because it's the unknown. I start sketching and trying things until all of a sudden something emerges that becomes interesting and I sort of follow it. But it's intuitive, it's not preconceived. I don't have an exact plan of action, and I always feel like I'm leaping off a cliff. Isenberg, do you feel like you're taking your collaborators with you? Gehry, I collaborate with people on projects because it enriches the mix and gets you somewhere you might not have gotten to on your own. When it's really working, it is like holding hands and jumping off a cliff together. Now this picture is the new Facebook headquarters building that Gehry designed for Mark Zuckerberg and which opened last May. The way Gehry tells it, Zuckerberg wasn't exactly sure what he wanted in this new headquarters building. So Gehry said, well, come to Los Angeles, we'll sit here, we'll talk about it, and something will happen. So Zuckerberg came to Los Angeles, they sat there in Gehry's workspace, and Zuckerberg said, you know, I like this. And so he was so taken with what he saw, they asked for something very similar. As you can see, he got it. A big open space. Now, we're particularly lucky to be talking about Frank Gehry right now because the Los Angeles County Museum of Art is hosting an exhibition of Gehry's work where you can see most of the things that I've told you about. And the show is at LACMA's Resnick Pavilion until March 20, and it highlights Gehry's work and philosophy from the early 60s when he established his firm in Los Angeles to the present. It included more than 200 drawings, many of which have never been seen publicly before, and 65 models. This particular photograph shows the last room of the exhibition, full of his current designs. Now, much of that work is destined for Los Angeles, and his designs and his models show such things as a house he has designed for artist John Baldessari, a multi-use building at Crescent Heights and Sunset, a new home for the Jazz Bakery, a children's center in Watts, and more. And now one last question from Frank Gehry. Isenberg, is there an advantage to achieving fame when you're older? Gehry, my experience with friends who became famous in younger years was that it was really difficult for them to sustain. I feel blessed that whatever fame I've gotten came when I was in my 60s and my 70s. So if it looks like it's going the other way, I can gracefully retire. So I'd be glad to take your questions. Yes.
Can you please comment on the new home that's being built for him now?
You mean the home in Santa,
The new one.
pardon me?
The new home.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I thought that he was building a new home.
He's not doing it, to my knowledge.
Do you mean on Adelaide? Is that what you're?
He bought 2 lots.
He bought lots in Santa Monica on Adelaide. I think that his
Yeah,
son,
vandalism and
his son Sam Gehry, who is now an architect also, is working on that, a new house for them. But you know, they were working on, he and others are working on a house in Venice that didn't happen. So I don't know. I can't imagine them leaving the current house, but you don't know. Someone else had their hand up?
I was going to say, years ago, I mean, in the early 70s, I saw a piece of corrugated chair. I'd never seen it. It was the best, most exciting piece of furniture. It's a
Well,
Frank
you can
Gehry.
get it on eBay.
Well, I know it's a Frank Gehry, so I've never heard of Frank Gehry. I never knew who
Yeah.
he was, but it was an exciting piece of furniture.
She's talking about the corrugated,
It was fabulous.
corrugated,
Easy edges.
yeah, easy edges, that's right.
It was the
You all know so much about Frank Gehry.
And I never heard of it.
Yeah, well, you probably wouldn't have at that time. He was doing cheap housing. Because that, you start out, those are the kind of clients you get. And, he has continued to make furniture and the jewelry and the lamps. I mean, there's just, I get a Google alert for him. And there's something every day about either something from his past, something he's working on now. Yes.
Does he ever go back and look at buildings he's done, like the University of Minnesota building years ago, and want to go back and do things differently? And has he been asked to redo some of his old early buildings?
Could everyone hear that? Well, actually, the university, the building in Minnesota is my favorite Frank Gehry building. And he was going to do an expansion of it, but I don't know if that was postponed or killed or...
It's under construction.
It's under construction? That's a chance. When you get to expand, you get the chance to look at it again. And the building that he uses the most is Disney Hall. I mean, I go to Disney Hall a lot, and it's rare when I'm there and he's not. He has a place he likes to sit. He's almost always there listening to music. Or at the Ojai Festival, which is new music. I've never gone there without seeing him.
The building at the University of Minnesota is the study for Bilbao.
Well, it's very similar, yeah.
It preceded Bilbao and brought up all the forms that would be used in Bilbao. And you see it all reflected in the river, just exactly as the river.
Yeah, I don't know that that was conscious.
Oh, no, I didn't mean reflecting in the river was conscious, but it's just the two buildings, if you showed them.
No,
side by side.
the reflecting of the river was conscious. That was one of the things that the University of Minnesota, what is it, the University of Minnesota Art Museum, is that the correct
Yeah.
name? The Wiseman
The
Art Museum is on a river. And if you notice, so many of his buildings are on rivers. And that was one of the inspirations for him in terms of how he designed that museum. And it was also an inspiration for how he designed Bilbao. Because when you go to Bilbao, you enter by going down so that you're kind of at the level of the river. And that's intentional too. He thinks about these things.
The thing that fascinated me about Bilbao was how it interacted with the freeways. I'll never forget the ribbons of the freeways and the way it worked with that building.
Well, you know what? I do not know if the freeways came after the museum.
Well, they obviously were there because I've only been to Bilbao once. And when I was there, it was an enormous,
Right, but what I'm saying is
Relationship
Bilbao
between what was
was a very different place before that museum was built.
The freeways came after.
You know, there's,
well, but it must have come within the time of the building because otherwise they wouldn't have been there when I was there. I was there at the very inception, so how could they just?
I mean, I don't know. I was only there a few years ago. But people don't understand how big and how prepossessing the building in Bilbao is. But if you go to Bilbao, you can see that museum from almost anywhere in the city. And it's larger than the Metropolitan. And if you think about it, you know, the Metropolitan's on the edge of Central Park. Bilbao is kind of like almost in the middle of a city. And I mean, that's sort of staggering.
Made the city. Bilbao made the city.
It did.